So my name's Dominic. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Global Trust Project. We work with organizations and governments to operationalize trustworthiness. And we go on to explain that even though trust is in our title, right, the Global Trust Project, we actually don't build trust. As you well know, trust is not something you build, it is an outcome. But what we believe we can build and what we believe can bring value is building trustworthiness, right? And as you may subscribe to those functional veriform universals, there are 3 of them, upon which research tells us trust is grounded, which is integrity, benevolence, and capabilities. And then, of course, there's that moderator of propensity or willingness to trust, and that is rooted in a whole bunch of things. So we work with organizations and governments to operationalize trustworthiness, and we frame it to get our foot in the door. We frame it in a number of different ways. If we speak into government, we would say that high trust countries outperform low trust countries just along GDP lines. You and I well know that there's a mass of well-being indicators out there that show the correlation between generalized trust and well-being. But that's how we'd frame it with government. With organizations, we would quote research like high trust organizations outperform low trust organizations just along financial lines around 450%. Teams, we would refer to Zach and him, his oxytocin thing, and it's over 100%, they're more resilient, so on and so forth. But when we get our foot in the door, it's just a matter of time until the person who has agency in that setting realizes that trust starts with the individual and one's self-perception of trust or trustworthiness, and then it works itself out in many different ways, with your colleague, with stakeholders, with fellow leaders, with customers, so on and so forth. My personal conviction and the way I frame it as of 49 years old.
Well, you're very young.
Yeah, I know. I'm a kipper, wet behind the ears. The way I frame it, and the way that just really makes sense to me, is I'm deeply interested in closing distance. So closing distance between what psychologists might frame as the true and the false self, closing that distance. Closing distance between myself and the other, to the extent I'm able to help others close distance between themselves. And the bridge between there and the world of work or organizational work and public life it's logical. Okay. But it's closing distance. And the reason for that is it appears that the world that we're given, however you want to splice and dice it and frame it, the world we are given appears to work and appears to have developed, emerged in such a way that it needs to work together, right from the quantum level to the very, very big, from the very small to the very big. Somewhere in between, you've got these relational things between people and the environments we find ourselves in. And we should be working together. There should ideally not be fundamental distance between us. So hence, these types of conversations are very interesting to me. And hence the name of this conversational series called Closing Distance. Conversations about how trust closes distance between us. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, great. So along the way, I've used your organization's name in vain, often because of the work you do.
In vain.
And if it's got Gallup on it, it means, man, it's the gospel truth, right? And I know I say that jokingly, of course, because any scientist doesn't talk about proof. I get it. We talk about evidence, and the evidence shows, and we do our best to make sense of the space that we're in. Okay. But you are, of course, deeply involved with trust. You're deeply involved with the correlation between trust and outcomes, between well-being, so on and so forth. So hence, as a global voice in this space, it brings me knocking on your door. So if we could just open up with who Gallup is and who you are within that space, and then I'll take out my scalpel and my chisel and then see where it goes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chisel away. Gallup is a global analytics and advice firm. We have immense reach around the globe. So in the work that I'm involved in at Gallup, I get the pleasure of studying the aggregate and helping to design studies at the aggregate global level. I was involved in the original team that developed the world poll that many people are familiar with now. So a representative sample of the globe. And but the other thing that I really get a kick out of, and I guess get my mission purpose behind, is studying organizations and leadership management and organizational culture, and going deep inside of organizations to understand some of the causal factors that influence outcomes that organizations are interested in. Certainly trust is a big component. I'd say a foundational component of getting a culture right if you want it to sustain and be resilient. So you might think of my work as kind of looking at a macro level, but also going deep at a micro level inside organizations, and then taking those learnings and then also putting them back on the macro level to see how the population's going or doing at that level. What with the end goal to create some change, to do science, to conduct science that's rigorous, but also is interpretable and usable for people that aren't scientists. So that's part of the challenge of my work, and part of what I enjoy is working with our team to conduct rigorous scientific studies with complex methods, but then to pull out findings that both represent that complexity, but also are usable.
Yeah.
To create some real change. I think science without application doesn't really do us much good. That's where I've
Okay.
focused I'm approaching 40 years in this field. And so there's been a lot of learning along the way, and a lot of, I've been able to see a lot of change happen. I don't know if that's at a global level. I think there's a lot more to come. A lot more that's needed, and it's an issue of scaling.
Mm.
Learning from the science and scaling it.
Let me just shamelessly set up my first question in a very self-serving way, but it entails you you wouldn't mind me a clear sense of the reach of Gallup as an organization and the impact that you do have. So the reach and the impact that Gallup has, and then I'll shamelessly go into my first question.
Okay. Well, for a macro level, the reach is 160 plus countries around the world in terms of representative samples on at least an annual basis. We're working hard with our methodologies to increase the frequency on that. In terms of workplaces, over 70 million employees. We've surveyed over time thousands of organizations.
Did you say 70 million employees? 70 million in, how does that even work?
It's called sticking to your guns, and over time and collecting data on elements that generalize across different populations and getting it activated inside organizations so the leaders can use the data to create some change.
So
And
you have,
it's called having a lot of partners too, right?
yeah.
I've got a lot of partners.
Okay. Okay, so you've surveyed about 70 million employees. Okay, over time. Okay, great. And the impact?
That's inside organizations, so that doesn't include the polling work that we do. So that's just inside organizations, and we
Good heavens. Okay.
poll hundreds of thousands, but 70 million, yeah, we update that every year. But that goes back to the late 90s.
Yeah.
We've been
And then if
trending employee engagement in the U.S. since 2000, globally since 2009.
and if a skeptic puts up their hand and says, "Well, so you've done this research, fantastic. What is the impact of the work?" What do you say to that?
Well, we actually study outcomes like with businesses, profitability, how customers perceive their service, whether employees stay or leave their organizations. We hold ourselves accountable to outcomes that are meaningful to organizations. I'll keep going on that train, and then I'll go a bit broader. But we look at the quality of work through actual metrics that organizations provide. We look at whether employees show up to work or not. We look at safety accidents on the job, and whether what we're measuring links to that. We celebrate some of the top so you could look at the global averages of 1 in 5 people globally are highly engaged in their work, about 1 in 3 in the US. There are organizations that have really put a lot of effort into this concept of engagement, which trust underlies, right? It's kind of a foundation to getting highly engaged employees. And they're at more than triple the global average and more than double the US average, like 70% plus. And they have maintained that through these really crazy times we've been through the last several years. So they build a foundation of, a trusting culture that builds resilience. So you watch that too. We've been able to track this over decades and look at how building an engaging, trusting environment actually predicts outcomes stronger during tough times because it differentiates organizations, becomes a differentiator. At the global level, we've looked at things like GDP per capita, unemployment rates. It's interesting. Right now, we're digging into, we know hours worked matters in terms of productivity, but what matters even more than hours worked is whether people are doing what they do best and how many hours per week they're doing what they do best. That's a really good predictor of GDP per capita change over time across countries. So how do I know that works, we conduct meta-analyses across organizations. We've now just completed our 11th iteration of meta-analysis of engagement and performance. And we look at data at the global level to see how our metrics link to outcomes that are important to the world and to to organizational leaders. So, and we expand the number of topics based on, what the issues are that we're studying. But in general, we're looking at how people view their lives and how they view their work and how they view their leadership globally.
As an organization with that kind of reach, that history, having engaged at least 70 million people in the organizational setting at a minimum, there's something early in this conversation which you said, which to me is very, very interesting, and I'd love to mine down into it. You said that trust is fundamental. So an organization of that stature, its lead scientist or one of its lead scientists saying that trust is fundamental. What is it that you mean?
Well, I mean, people come into organizations wanting to make a difference, and inevitably there are relationships inside the organization. There's a potential relationship with leadership, there's a potential relationship with your manager, and there's a potential relationship with your coworkers. People expect, I think, that they're going to have a trusting environment, but you've got to have the agency to get there. You've got to have you can't have roadblocks. And what I mean by that is, if you go into an environment and you join an organization, you want to make a difference, you've got to have clarity in terms of what your goals are and what your role is in the organization. If people are confused about their clarity, they quickly lose trust. And that's foundational. If people don't have what they need to do their work, they lose trust. That's foundational. That could start with leadership, but it could also be how the manager positions, their work. We found 70% of the variance in team engagement goes right back to the local manager. But I think, from a leadership perspective, it's a little different, especially in large organizations. Now, I get a bit maybe philosophical and anthropological about some of this, in that large organizations are a pretty recent occurrence in our human evolution. We existed in smaller groups for a long time, and so trust in a small group setting comes about in a somewhat different way than it does in an organizational setting with a lot of groups where leaders have to pull a lot of teams together and they may have limited exposure. And so anytime you have physical distance, and leadership in large organizations, there's naturally more physical distance that occurs that creates some mental distance. And it's easier when people rate how well things are going, to point a finger at something more distant than them than it is to point a finger at something more local. So I would say in a large organization, which we have a lot more of now, and again, a newer occurrence if you really look at the big picture and the history of organizations and teams and all that in our human existence, leaders have to do a few things. One is they've got to have a purpose that is succinct enough and motivational enough that people want to be a part of it, where they could talk about the purpose of the organization and easily talk about it with their coworkers, talk about it with somebody outside the organization. So that's a first thing. You can put a purpose out there. That doesn't necessarily build trust, though. In fact, it can erode trust if you don't have the things to support it. I was working with a mining company a while back, and I scanned, as with their executive leadership, and I always scan all the information I can before I meet with a group like that, including their website. I mentioned to them that, and they talked pretty passionately about what their, value was to society.
On the website?
No, in person.
So for real, right? Okay.
In person. And I commented to them, there's nothing on your website in a clear one or two sentences that says your value to society. Not that that's the end all be all, but it's a starting point, right? You've got to get that clear first if you want to build a passionate following. But then you've got to have people actually believe that it's real. That means they've got the things that support getting that done. And then when people do something at a local level, regardless of what their job is, that supports that purpose, they need to be recognized for it. They need to, that's the manager's job at all levels. But where organizations start breaking down in trust is at the middle management level. Let's say upper middle management it starts with executive teams and how they work together, how they communicate with the people that report directly to them, how they provide them the resources they need, how they recognize them, how they build an environment where people feel cared about authentically. And caring sounds soft, but it links to just about every outcome that we've had a chance to study. So I lump all this into human nature. Actually, the reason why everything I'm talking about actually works from an outcome standpoint is because it's human nature. And that,
Yes. You know, the way that we often refer to trust is it's a fundamentally, or building trustworthiness is a fundamentally human endeavor, and everything else follows. And I would just like to tie into one of the first things you mentioned. You referred to this correlation between proximity and perceived trustworthiness, right? Proximity versus, and the further you go away, things become less trustworthy. So human endeavor and proximity. So with regards to it being fundamentally human, absolutely. It appears to me that ever since sort of the current form of hominids, right, left the African continent between 150 and 200,000 years ago, we left with parts of the brain and the gut that are still with us. And science has spliced and diced us in a million different ways, as well as common sense has, and has concluded that those very fleshy parts of our brain and gut that we left the African continent with, and, either went left or right when we went over to sort of the Middle East, they're still with us, and they're looking for basic things. I in you now, I'm looking for integrity and all that means. I in you, I'm looking for benevolence. I in you, I'm looking for capabilities. And also, together, we're trying to make sense of our inclinations, to trust each other, which is, prejudice and bias and perspectives and that sort of thing. But this is not something that we choose to do, given the fact that we are human. Those bits of us are firing all the time, implicitly and explicitly, knowingly and unknowingly. And sometimes the way we frame it is this: ever since we left the African continent, as I just mentioned to you, ever since we took our first breath and we followed that purple line, if we came out via natural birth, we follow that purple line, up the middle of the tongue, and we go to where we need to go and we lock on, right? Ever since the first breath, ever since we took our first high five, ever since we stole our first kiss, ever since we entrusted ourselves or someone else into the care of someone else, ever since we sent out our first invoice, we've been looking for signals of trustworthiness. And just because we walk into the world of work doesn't mean our identity is wholly employee or manager or leader. Organizational machine, which was invented just maybe not even 100 years ago by Freeman or Fryman, the fellow who invented the organizational structure. It's an invention of, and the organization of people is an invention of recent history.
Right.
And we just now, in my perspective, over the last 15, 20 years, really coming to grips with the fact that we are in fact, and you said earlier it might sound a bit soft or something, but let me say this might sound a bit soft. We're being reminded of the fact that we are in fact human, and fundamentally so. And unless we can get to grips with that fundamental stuff of which trust is so important, or to which trust is so important, this stuff called organizational setting or societal setting or productivity or performance will never fully be what it's intended to be. And that's part of the fight, perhaps, that we have, is getting past the so-called softness of it all to realize that the human condition and the stuff we're trying to achieve with all that mechanistic language is one and the same thing.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that a lot of what was developed in terms of the human interventions through the Industrial Revolution took on industrial kind of characteristics, right? So we'd give people a once-a-year performance rating, and they would have no clue how you came up with that. Almost treating people as if they're, mechanized machines. But we spend more time working, if we're lucky, more, except for sleeping, than anything else we do. And we're bringing our humanness into work. Why not leverage that? Why not make the most of that? Why not bring a sense of interest, trusting our colleagues, friendships, fun, and doing what we do best is important too. I would argue a big part of trust is people knowing each other's strengths. I would take that all the way back to a lot of the stuff that we measure now and have operationalized has been, as constructs, has been around, as you mentioned, for a long, long time, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. But we've just figured out ways to put measurement and operationalization behind it. Drinks is one example of that, where if we can more quickly help people get to know what's different about them from somebody else, or what's the same about them from somebody else, you can shorten that distance a lot more quickly and build trust more quickly, instead of me sitting across the table from you and thinking to myself, why can't Dominic be more like me? It frustrates me that he does things that way and I do things my way, and I think my way is the best way. but then I figure out you've got maybe a strength that overlaps with mine, and you might have some that are different, and it makes you complement me. And I think that naturally happened in tribes early on. Right. You have, most of us have, if we don't have our own kids as adults, we've got other family members who have kids, or we've got neighbors who have kids. And we notice very quickly that these kids don't come unless they're, identical twins, which some of which they're different too. But these kids come out very different. They have very different personalities, even in the same families. And I think that's part of that grand design. I mean, that's my take on it. It's part of human nature, and it makes teams better. And it makes, and if you can take those differences and speed up or shorten the distance between people, knowing those differences, you can build trust because the handoffs are easier, right? And that's how you build teams effectively. So I think knowing human nature from the trait perspective is really important in addition to the culture part of it.
Yeah. Before we get back to trust per se, let's just step sideways for a moment. Strengths, the strength finders. Can you remind me, has the Gallup strength finders, has that been spun off from Gallup, or is it still part of it? Or was it brought in? It's a bit murky for me.
It's a Gallup invention. It was invented by Don Clifton. He was my mentor for 17 years. I worked with him for those years studying top performing people in a wide variety of jobs. And that tool came out of the themes that were most generalizable across people when we studied success. And so it was invented. I'll tell you just a little bit of a story about it. So we had conducted in-depth interviews, for a long time, listening to people, asking people questions, listening to them, coding their responses, and then scoring them on various traits. And a guy named Phil Stone at Harvard, he was just way more advanced than most people, like a prodigy, right? I think he got his PhD before he was 20 or something. But he was at Harvard and was in the science of studying content analysis. I happened to connect with him when I was doing my master's thesis because it was on the same topic, and he sent me everything I wanted immediately. Very friendly guy. But anyway, he ended up becoming one of our senior scientists at Gallup, and he had observed a lot of the work we've done, the great in-depth work we were doing. We're asking people questions, long transcripts, coding responses. And he said to Don, there's this thing coming right now called the internet. And if you don't build something that fits into kind of a web-based platform that leverages everything you've learned, I think people are never going to really capitalize on what you've learned over all these years. Don came out of the war and he wanted to do something great for people and became a psychologist and first an academic psychologist, then an applied psychologist. And his whole goal was to study what's right with people, which was kind of the opposite of what most psychology had done at that time. In any event, the Clifton Strengths tool, formerly called Strengths Finder, as you mentioned, started with Don. And I remember Don saying, I wonder what it would be like if 1 million people took this instrument. And since then, he passed in 2003. We've now collected strengths on well over 30 million people globally. I think it's 35 now. And it's been used widely. Most organizations use it, at least in pockets, Some organizations use it throughout the century. Massive organization uses it throughout the organization as a way for people to have better conversations. If you asked Don back then why he built it, it wasn't just to give people a test and feedback on the test results. It was to build more effective conversations between people, which I would call, that shortening the distance between people and making our conversations between each other more effective. So that was the real goal. And then we studied it and we found it in colleges, it reduces student retention if they've got feedback on their strengths. And it's even better if they've got episodes throughout their college career where they bring it back and bring it into what they're doing and make it contextual to what they're doing. So it isn't just like awareness. Awareness is important, but thinking through the integration of strengths into your overall life and your work, I think, is the most important thing.
So back to trust per se, we talk about it so much, and that's the collective we. You can't trust anyone anymore. The world is, and of course, like Antonio Guterres when I say this, the world is suffering a bad case of trust deficit disorder.
You're talking
Trust
about
is in
media?
decline. Yeah, exactly. All that stuff. However, the next question often is met with very interesting and divergent answers. And the question is simple. what is trust? And I've asked several hundred people this, what is trust? And the answers go all over the place, right? Not in a bad way, not in a silly way, not at all, but in a way which I think, in not being able to define it, loses a lot of the opportunity that would come with having a shared understanding of what trust in fact is. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So when someone asks you, what is trust? How do you answer them?
At a basic level, I think it's about reliability. I think it's about, can I count on, if it's between two people, can I count on this person? And at a deeper level, it's about, a relationship where you can open up, you can be your true self, and the other person accepts that. I think there's a level of confidentiality that comes with it at a high level. It can get to the level of trust, can start at a basic level where it's just almost transactional reliability. And then at a higher level, it can be deeply relational. Like the best managers in the world have really strong relationships with the people they manage, in that they don't have to ask them about their life, which can feel awkward. It just happens because they've done what they need to with the work part of it. They've gotten people what they need to do their work. They recognize them when they do good work. They help them see how their work connects to the bigger purpose. They help them figure out how to collaborate with other people that they're working with effectively. All of that work stuff builds trust, which then opens up the door for the other person to say, well, I've got this issue, with my family that I've got to take care of. And then the manager then understands how they can accommodate, figures out how to accommodate for that, I think the high level of trust that comes with somebody opening up about themselves is not intrusive. It's just natural. That's when you get to the really high. So I think of it as like levels. There's a transactional level, and then there's a more personal level.
Yeah. And before we go back to the notion of the relationship between trust and distance and proximity, one definition, or it seems to be a definition that's used quite often in the literature of trust, we found very useful and also quite alienating simultaneously. It's useful because I think it's fairly accurate. It's difficult because it is particularly human sounding. And when something sounds particularly human in the world of work, in some settings, people try and struggle to find its utility or perceived utility or pragmatism and application. So the definition that I use often is trust is the willingness to be vulnerable based on expected behaviors. It's the willingness to be vulnerable based on expected behavior. So that's true for colleagues, customers, investors, debtors, credit, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that'd be up the ladder in the higher level. For sure.
Yes, indeed. And then it begs the question, well, what are those expected behaviors that you are anticipating so that that psychological state of trust can emerge? And then that segues neatly into the conversation of those three principles: integrity, benevolence, and capabilities. The degree to which we see those in each other's, the degree to which it can be said that the psychological state emerges, and the barrier between us is our inclination or our propensity, which is grounded in our experience of the past as opposed to our present reality. And I personally find that in the world of work, that when that connection can be made between this willingness to be vulnerable and those three principles and the outcomes it brings, that's when the really exciting work happens. That's that correlation, that relationship. Now back to proximity and trust. Perhaps you've no doubt come across that term cognitive pre-coding, and it is my understanding of the term it's our brain's way of staying sane in a way. In other words, you and I, we meet 100 people a day, and those 100 people have 1,000 ideas, and those 1,000 ideas interact with the 1,000 ideas all the other 100 people have, and then you have just millions of possibilities and hundreds of conversations and many ways in which to try and find correlation between those ideas and yourself, et cetera, and it can become overwhelming. So we pre-code, and that involves heuristics and it involves judgment and bias. So let's say I meet Jim and we have a 5-hour conversation, and I meet 5 Jims in one day. To hold those 5 hours of 25 hours of conversation, it's just too much. So I code him. I code Jim to be a few things which I can understand, etc. But the problem with that is Jim is so much more. But I've met him at a place and time, I've coded him, and Jim will forever be Jim. And so we miss so much of each other. And that's not to say that we can have 25 hours worth of conversation stored and ready to go all the time. But it is to say that we should remain vigilant to be humble about what we know about others and always open to, being surprised of others. And it also, I think, provides insight or useful perspective on proximity, because those who are close to us, we can spend more time with, but those who are far away, if we just have one thin slice and go, okay, that's that thing over there, and we don't have that relational connection, and therefore the state of trust is not associated with that which we're not in relationship with, then just by default, it's less trusting, just because it's a function of distance, right? That shows up it shows up in our research all the time. That which is closer is more trustworthy. That which is further away is less trustworthy. So my colleague sitting over here, I love the man, or the woman, I'll go to war with them. But my manager, yeah, great person, but not that trustworthy. The leader, on average, I'm talking about the leaders, they don't see me, they don't understand me, they're not transparent, and so on and so forth. There's to our mind, a lot of exciting work to be done there to close the distance between perception and reality, which is a wonderful journey. Have you found that in your research, journeying with clients to close that distance between perceptions and reality?
Yeah. When you talked about cognitive pre-coding, it made me think immediately of confirmation bias and potentially the dark side of trust, right? That today if we have the transactional trust with certain medium, it can just feed our preconceptions, and then we continue to distrust the other side of things without listening. I mean, it takes a lot of intentionality to listen to both. If I make it one side versus the other, it takes some intentionality to learn other perspectives. But yeah, I mean, from a leadership standpoint, we just did I'm glad to send you the article that we just published on this, but we actually asked leaders what their biggest concerns were, and we asked employees what's making them feel more distant. So you could equate that with trust, right? We're finding employees are more detached from their employers than ever in recent history, anyway. And the things that employees say are missing are organizational culture, which is a sense of belonging, some autonomy, some well-being, company actually being concerned about their well-being and feeling connected to their values. The culture was a part of it, the transparency of leaders. So how do you close the gap between the distant leader and the local employee? Well, there's got to be some level of what the employee perceives as transparency through communication, how stable their employment is, some clarity about what the vision of the company is. Leaders need to be visible in many ways. If they're visible, and it closes that distance that you're talking about, at least somewhat. And they've got to feel like they're somewhat involved, which means their local manager needs to be helping them think about, here's our strategic vision as a company, here's our goals, and how in your job can we adjust things to meet those goals, right? Involving them. And that builds trust. If I involve you, ask your opinions, because you're probably closer to the action than I am as a manager. And it's not that hard to do. It's listening, but it's rarely done. Listening to people at a local level is a big factor. So I'll just go through the themes real quickly here for you. Organizational culture, leadership transparency. People said they needed to close that gap. Some of it was resource investment. So am I given what I need to do my work? That builds credibility and trust. And then some basics of performance management. Is there some accountability? How can I trust a culture when I do something well and somebody else doesn't and I'm not rewarded for it? Or how can I trust an organization that I don't feel really cares about my future and my development? So there has to be some systems around that in a big organization. And all that is sitting in the context where leaders right now have more financial and economic pressures. They've got an increasingly complex regulatory and political environment. They've got customers changing what they expect. They've got staffing and recruitment challenges. They've got complexities in terms of infrastructure and new technology and AI. So all these things are coming at leaders, making their jobs more difficult. Then the employees are feeling more distant, and that's coming at managers. So managers' engagement starting to drop. I guess my point is we've got to get leaders need to. I guess our research would suggest that there's some things leaders can do to close that distance that you talked about. It's not so, even though the default is somebody that is more distant from me, I'm going to immediately maybe trust less until I see some evidence. Now, a lot of people will join an organization with some kind of built-in trust, right? But it'll start to fade quickly if leadership isn't visible, and if they don't feel like they're transparent. And if they don't feel like there's clear cultural boundaries and a culture that they can get, values that they feel like that are authentic.
Yeah.
And all that.
Talking about
Go ahead.
Sorry, talking about authenticity, I find myself thinking now about, that old proverb. I don't think anyone really knows where it comes from, but there's rumors that it comes from China, right? And it goes like this: if you want to know what water is, don't ask a fish. And the moral of that little story is that the fish is so immersed in its watery existence to even contemplate that there is another existence is just ridiculous. So it's treated immediately with suspicion and incredulity, etc., etc. And the reason I'm thinking about that now is as I'm listening to you, you're using language which we all use and we need to use, and we use it for convenience and function, etc. And that language involves manager, leader, operations, goals, objectives, and the list can go on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a product, excuse the term, but it is a product of the organization, the organizational worldview. I've wondered very unsuccessfully, very unfruitfully, I've wondered if there's another way in which we can refer to those roles in a more human way, how we could humanize language essentially and get out of the water that we're in. Is there any research in that, or is there any interest in that? And firstly, and secondly, have you found that organizational language can be self-defeating? So is there interest in an alternative vocabulary, so to speak, and does that language defeat the purpose of bringing humanity back into work?
Well, I think it defeats the purpose if it confuses people. So I think if you're going to use alternative language, I think you need to be really clear about how it aligns with the culture you're trying to build, right? So you could move from a term boss to manager, or in our organization, it's called a go-to, someone you go to for, because it's built into our culture, right? It's someone you go to for advice, goal setting, to help you with your goal setting. So it kind of reverses it, right? From delegation to involvement. So I think you can do there's many organizations that insist on calling their employees associates. And we've used that term here as well, associates. We've even used a term like tribe members because we have a big mission about us, and we're a, what are we now? A 90-year-old, we call ourselves a 90-year-old startup. We started in 1935. It'll be 100 years in 10 years. But
yeah, you'll make it someday. Okay, give yourself time. Look, you've only engaged 70 million people. You've got a few billion to go.
We feel like we're just starting. But it's an example of, I think you can change the language to make it more humanistic as long as you're consistent with it and people know what you mean, and it becomes ingrained in your culture in terms of how you refer to people. I mean, we rarely, call someone a boss or we'll use the term manager once in a while, but the standard label for a manager is go-to. We still use leaders. We still use the term leadership. Trying to think of what else you would use there. But I guess you get my point. It's got to, if you're going to use the alternative language, you've got to ingrain it and you got to be consistent with it, and people can't be confused by it.
So when it comes to the mere 70 million responses that not you personally, but your organization has dealt with over the last 90 years, when it comes to the data that you've looked at with regards to trust, what is leapt out of the screen or off the page and slapped you in the face and said, hang on, your perception of reality is not that, it's actually this? In other words, what research has surprised you the most about trust?
I think the increasing lack of trust in leadership from all angles, whether you're talking about
increasing trust in leadership,
lack of trust,
so lack of trust,
decreasing trust in leadership.
And why has that slapped you in the face? Why has that been a surprise?
Because it's not getting better. You'd think that over time there'd be some learning that happens, but I think leaders get caught up in their own agendas. Congress in the U.S. is the least trusted. That's a leadership body that makes big decisions. Our polls would say they're probably at the bottom of the list on trust. Media is very low on trust. People don't, when we're talking about distant things like media and country leadership and institutions, the trust levels are low almost across the board. And you could say that maybe it's been fed by all the access to social media we have now and all the confirmation bias that gets fed into that. Maybe some of the lack of trust is deserved. Maybe some of it isn't, but it's there, and people they tend to act on what they perceive. On the other hand, you go to great organizations and there's really high trust in leadership. So it isn't a fatal kind of thing, but it's something that in aggregate, in societal terms, has not gone in the right direction. I could
Yeah.
send you a
So,
bunch of
so
trends
that
on that.
surprised you. So you were perhaps, let's frame it as optimistic. Let's say a decade ago or 2 decades ago, and you were perhaps thought to yourself, you know what? Here we are. This is our current baseline, our aggregate baseline of leadership in particular, and it is trusted at this level. And implicitly, perhaps you thought to yourself, you know what? Over time, this can be corrected. But it's done completely the opposite. And that is what slapped you in the face. That is what has surprised you at the levels to which it has plummeted.
Yeah, either leaders don't care or people are highly influenced by those echo chambers that they get into. Since the drop, you don't know exactly what the drops are due to, but it certainly has tended to coincide with the change in how media goes about things. And, in the US, there's kind of a dividing line, I guess you could say, the Walter Cronkite era where news was trusted, and these are the facts. And I'm not saying there aren't reporters that don't do things the right way. There are. I come across a lot of them that are really good. But, all the political stuff inside of that, special interest groups, all that can have some influence on.
Yeah.
And I think
So,
people see that.
yeah. Okay. So one of the chief scientists at Gallup, let me do something very distasteful now, because reality and the data is always full of nuance, right? But let me just in rapid succession ask you the same question of various institutions and contexts in society. And the question is, how should I frame it? Trust levels are low, medium, or high, and choose variance. I give that a go. Okay.
If you want,
So
I can pull up some trends and actually give you some. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, some data. Okay, great. That's super. Just to give because there's so much speculation about this, and data out there is sometimes very contradictory. I love the fact that you can just hit a few keys and you've got Gallup at your fingertips. It's wonderful.
Well, you can get on our website and do the same thing I'm doing. Gallup.
Got it.
So we have indicators that we track on leadership approval and trust.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Leadership and aggregate in the world, high, medium, low.
I would say low.
Okay. Leadership in the world on aggregate for governments.
Low.
Commercial organizations.
Low.
Non-profit organizations.
A little higher. I'd say medium.
Okay. Interpersonal relationships, would that be called generalized trust?
I think with people that, interpersonal relationships for people that they know, it's higher.
Okay. And generalized trust in the world, the person down the street is generally trustworthy, that type of research question on aggregate.
People are trustworthy of what's local. I guess that's the way I'd answer that. They're less trustworthy of what's distant.
And where is trust currently positively high and showing very strong signs of improving significantly over let's say, the short to medium term? So currently high and currently showing signs of improvement, significant improvement across any of those spaces in society.
My best answer to that would be organizations with great leadership. Trust is very high, and it has.
And what are they enjoying as a result? What are those organizations in and of collectively as an organization enjoying in terms of its missions in the world and the people within those organizations?
The people within those organizations are experiencing high involvement, enthusiasm for their organization, high interest in their jobs. They're producing at high levels. They're holding their own during crises. The organizations themselves are more profitable. They're serving their customers effectively. So the most variance in what you just asked about is at the organizational level, and then within organizations at the team level. So the reason these organizations are unique to other organizations is because they have built a cadre of very effective managers who are in touch with people and have built trust with those individual employees.
It's the holy grail right there, right?
Yeah.
It's just people, managers are often leaders, right? It's often interchangeable. It's a person who cares deeply about other people in the world of work in close proximity to get stuff they believe in done. And is that not the holy grail?
It is. And you've got to have leaders that pull teams together too. So at the leader level, it's the people that report directly to them. It's that group, right? And so leaders become more visible, whether they're physically visible or not. They become more visible through the people they manage directly and, how they authentically live the culture.
You're guilty of saying, as I am, of saying that trust is a fundamentally human thing, right? It's part of our human condition. So it seems to me to make sense to end on that note in the following way. So, chief scientist of Gallup, for all of the people who might be listening right now or might listen in the future who are really feeling a lack of trust in the world of work, or maybe even personally, for all the reasons we've discussed, if it's media or politicians or organizations, etc., and they don't know how to get it back into the room for all the good reasons we've discussed. How do they do it, and where's the hope for them?
So are you referring to an individual with their team, for instance? Or because trust is very contextual, right?
So let's say the person, the leader, no, let's say the manager of a team
Mm-hmm.
in the world of work. They're up the creek without a paddle, but they believe with all their heart that what they're doing has mission, it has purpose, and it is good to do. But trust left the room a long, long time ago. How do they recover that trust? Because they know that trust is the fundamental challenge that they're confronted with.
You've got to create some new habits. First and foremost, if they do authentically believe in what the purpose is about, they need to say what it is in a very succinct way that makes sense to that team in terms of their function. And that team needs to be able to remember it and repeat it to one another. So that's one thing. It's got to resonate in a simple way. Second, when I said habits, they've got to create new habits where they are having, I'm just going to give you something very tangible, one meaningful conversation with each person they manage every week. What happens in those meaningful conversations? They involve the person in setting goals that are meaningful to them and that attach to that mission or purpose. They're recognizing them for work that they've done that connects to that mission or purpose. They're talking with them about how they collaborate with their colleagues and how that relates to the mission or purpose of the organization. And by the way, when they do that, they learn some things from colleagues about somebody else that they can recognize secondhand, which is even more valuable, right? Jane said this about you that you might not know about in terms of your contribution. They get to know the strengths of each person so that they can close that distance more quickly. And they're transparent about their own strengths and their own, every strength has a downside to it too. I've got high focus. It can have downsides. I've got to be transparent about that. Here's when my focus is firing, this is some stuff that goes right. Here's some other things that can go wrong. I might ignore you or something. So don't with that transparency, don't hesitate to knock on my door and interrupt me if I'm in high focus, because I've also got relator and I want to talk to you.
Yeah.
So there's stuff like that, right? So I'm going through a few things, but the simple answer is I've got to have a new habit of being in touch with each person individually at least once a week. And it could be 15 to 30 minutes, but it has to be a habit. If you build that habit, you can start building trust in a currently desperate situation.
Now, as a scientist with 40 years under your belt, at least, with such a famous organization, are you sure there isn't a more technical answer you want? Don't you want to just rattle off some technical scientific jargon that makes it sound like this elixir that we can just buy off the shelf?
Well, all this technical scientific evidence is underneath that thing I just told you. So I told you early on, my job is we'll publish these kinds of things in technical journals, but my job is to take that and make it useful. And so that habit that I just told you about comes from that, from the science, and it works.
Jim, I've had you for well over an hour, and I'm very grateful. We didn't even touch on your books. We didn't go down very deeply into Gallup's strength or Clifton's strengths, which is just two fascinating topics. We didn't speak much about Gallup, although I was in a friendly way making fun of the fact that you part of one of the most respected organizations in the world. So much more to talk about is what I'm trying to say. But I'm very grateful for the time that you've afforded this stranger, and I will certainly be following your work with much interest as you speak to the next 70 million people.
Well, thanks, Dominic, for inviting me to your podcast here, and always glad to have more discussions. And I learned a lot from you as well.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your deep thinking.